It started with a cough. My husband, John, was sitting in his favourite armchair when a deep rattling sound ripped out of his chest, a sound so awful it made the whole room feel cold. He pulled his handkerchief away from his mouth, and I saw a dark, ugly stain on the white cloth. Then my son Mark looked over and said the words that broke my world. "A hospital! Do you know how much that costs?" His sister Sarah added, "Hospitals are too expensive for the old." Friend, before I go on, let me ask you, would you do me a kindness? Tap subscribe so you don't miss what comes next, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from. It helps me see just how far my story reaches. I just stared at them. These were the children I had raised, the ones I had rocked to sleep and nursed through fevers. Now, they were looking at their own father, like he was nothing more than a bill to be paid. I saw John's face, pale and scared, and then I looked back at them. There was no worry in their eyes, no love. There was just a cold, hard emptiness. It wasn't just about saving money. I could feel it deep in my bones. This was something else, something much darker. And as they stood there guarding the path to the phone, I had to wonder, how long had they been waiting for him to die? My mind screamed, "Call for help!" I wouldn't let them do this. John needed a doctor and I was going to get him one. I stood up, my legs trembling, and walked right past my children toward the old rotary phone on the kitchen wall. I could feel their eyes on my back. My hand was shaking so badly I could barely lift the receiver. I put my finger in the little hole for the number 9, ready to dial 911, but before I could even turn it, a hand covered mine. It was my son, Mark. He gently took the phone from me and placed it back in its cradle. "Mum, stop," he said, his voice so calm it was chilling. "You're getting all worked up over nothing." "He's sick, Mark. We have to do something," I cried, my voice cracking. "I know, and we will," he said, standing in front of me like a wall. "We'll take care of him right here. I'm doing this for your own good." He wasn't yelling. He was just firm. It was the way you'd talk to a child having a tantrum. In that moment, he stopped being my son and became my guard. And I knew, with a certainty that terrified me, that if he could stop me from using the phone, he could stop me from doing anything. Later that day, my daughter Sarah showed up with a bag of groceries. She was smiling, acting like everything was perfectly normal. She came into the kitchen and started unpacking things onto the counter. There was no medicine, no cough syrup, nothing that would actually help her father. Instead, she pulled out boxes of herbal tea, a jar of expensive honey and some ginger root. She turned to me, her smile never reaching her eyes. "See, Mum, I told you we'd take care of him," she said, holding up a box of chamomile tea. "These natural remedies are so much better for Dad than all those harsh hospital chemicals." I looked at the useless things on my counter while John coughed weakly from the living room. It felt like a slap in the face. This wasn't care, it was a performance. Sarah was pretending to be a good daughter, all while letting her father get sicker and sicker. She was trying to make me believe I was the one who was crazy for wanting a doctor. As she put the kettle on, she said, "I'll stay for a few days to help you out." My heart sank. She wasn't here to help me. She was here to watch me. The next morning I waited until Sarah left to run her errands. The moment I heard her car pull away, I rushed to John's side. "Come on, sweetheart," I whispered, helping my weak husband out of his chair. "We're getting out of here." Each step toward the garage was slow and shaky, but with every inch, a little bit of hope grew in my chest. I was going to get him to an urgent care clinic, even if I had to carry him there myself. We finally reached the door to the garage, and I reached for the little hook where we've kept our car keys for 40 years. It was empty. My heart hammered against my ribs. "They're not here," I stammered. I checked my purse. I searched the little bowl on the counter. I even patted John's pockets, my hands frantic. Nothing. Just then, the phone rang. It was Sarah. "Hi, Mum," she said, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. "Everything okay?" "The car keys, Sarah. I can't find them. She sighed, a sound of fake patience. Oh, Mum, you're always misplacing things. Don't worry, I'll help you look for them when I get back. And then she hung up. A cold wave washed over me. I hadn't misplaced them. She had taken them. They had locked us in. I was sitting in the living room feeling like all the fight had gone out of me when I heard a knock at the front door. My heart gave a little jump. Mark was in the kitchen, so he answered it. It was our neighbour from across the street, Carol. She's a kind woman, always bringing over cookies during the holidays. She peered past Mark, trying to get a look inside. Hello, Mark. I was just wondering about your father. I haven't seen John out in his garden for a few days. Is he feeling all right? This was my chance. I tried to catch her eye, to send a message with my face that said, "Help me." But Mark stepped in front of me, putting a heavy arm around my shoulder. "Oh, Dad's just got a little bug," he said with a big, false smile. "We're taking great care of him. Mum here, she worries, don't you, Mum?" He squeezed my shoulder, a clear warning. Carol looked from his charming face to my terrified one. She bought his story completely. Well, it's just wonderful that he has such loving children to look after him. As she turned to leave, I watched my last hope walk down the driveway. Mark closed the door, and his smile vanished. The trap was shut again. That evening I was taking the kitchen trash out to the bin in the garage. It was a simple chore, something to keep my hands busy. As I tied the bag, my fingers brushed against a crumpled piece of paper buried under some wet coffee grounds. It was clear my children had tried to hide it. Curiosity got the better of me. I pulled the balled-up paper out, wiped it clean, and smoothed it out under the dim garage light. It was a statement from our savings account. My breath caught in my throat. I saw our names, John and Mary, printed at the top. Then I saw the transactions. There was a withdrawal for $5,000 from last Tuesday, another one for $7,000 before that. I ran my finger down the page, seeing thousands and thousands of dollars, our life savings, gone. Money we had never touched. A cold, sick feeling filled my stomach. This wasn't about them worrying about future hospital bills. This was different. This was stealing. They weren't just letting John die to save money. They were actively robbing him while he lay helpless in his own bed. And I knew this was only the beginning. I held that crumpled bank statement in my fist, and a hot, angry fire burned through my fear. I walked into the living room where my son, Mark, was watching television like it was any other day. I didn't say a word. I just threw the paper down on the coffee table in front of him. "What is this?" I demanded, my voice shaking. "Where is your father's money?" He didn't even flinch. He picked up the statement, glanced at it, and set it back down. "Calm down, Mum," he said, his voice flat. "It's for the best. Think of it as an early inheritance withdrawal." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Inheritance? Your father is still alive. This is stealing." That's when he looked at me, and his eyes were cold and empty. "No," he said slowly. "It's asset management. We're protecting what's left from being wasted on pointless medical bills." He leaned forward, and his voice dropped to a low threat. "And if you make a fuss, we'll have you declared incompetent. A judge will see a confused old woman and two loving children trying to manage her affairs. Now, who do you think they'll believe?" I felt the floor drop out from under me. He wasn't just my son anymore. He was my enemy. After Mark's threat, a heavy blanket of despair settled over me. I felt truly trapped, with no way out. All I could do was sit by John's bedside, watching his life slip away. His breathing had become so shallow, and the rattle in his chest was a constant, awful sound. He slept most of the day, and when he was awake, his eyes were cloudy and lost. I would hold his frail, cool hand and just talk to him, telling him stories from when we were young, my tears dripping onto our joined fingers. One afternoon, as I was whispering about our first little apartment, I felt a faint squeeze. His eyes fluttered open, and for a moment the fog was gone. He was looking right at me. He knew who I was. He tried to speak, but it came out as a dry croak. He swallowed hard and tried again, his voice a tiny raspy whisper. "Mary," he breathed, don't let them do this." Those 5 words hit me like a bolt of lightning. It was him. My John was still in there, and he was fighting. That whisper cut through all my fear and all my sadness. It was a promise I had to keep. My fear didn't disappear, but something new rose up to meet it. A cold, hard rage. John's whisper became my war cry. I had to find a new way to get help. The phone was watched, the car was gone, but then I remembered my tablet. I mostly used it for recipes, but it had email. I could write to my sister Janet, who lived 3 states away. I had to be clever. I waited until Sarah was busy in the living room, and I took the tablet to the kitchen counter, pretending to look up a recipe for chicken soup. I angled my body to block her view of the screen. My fingers trembled as I typed out a short, desperate message. "Janet, help. Something is wrong here with Mark and Sarah. John is very sick. They won't take him to a doctor. Please call the police. Don't let them know you heard from me." My heart was pounding. I held my breath and pressed the send button, but the message didn't go through. Instead, a little box popped up on the screen with words that made my blood run cold. "This action is blocked by your network administrator. Sarah." She was good with computers. She had locked me in a digital prison. They had thought of everything. How do you fight an enemy that has sealed every single door? Defeated, I went into our bedroom and just sank onto the edge of the bed. Every path was blocked. It was then, as I was staring at the floor, that I remembered something. In my nightstand, under years of old buttons and dried-up pens, was my very first cell phone. It was an old flip phone, the kind with real buttons. We'd disconnected the service for it years ago, but I'd read somewhere that even a dead phone could still call 911. Hope, small and fragile, flickered inside me. I found the old charger and plugged it in, hiding the phone under the bed. As the little screen lit up, I thought about who to call. Not the police. Mark and Sarah were too good at lying. I needed someone smarter. And then I remembered my old friend Linda. We hadn't spoken in a year, but she'd worked as a paralegal for 20 years. She knew the law. I waited until I heard Mark on a loud work call in the other room. It was my only chance. I grabbed the phone, locked myself in the bathroom, and my shaking fingers dialed the number I still knew by heart. It rang once, twice. Then, a loud banging started on the door. "Mum, what are you doing in there?" It was Mark. My heart leaped into my throat. Just as Linda's voice said, "Hello?" I whispered, "Linda, it's Mary. Help me," and hung up. I quickly flushed the toilet to make a sound and opened the door. Mark was standing there, his eyes narrowed with suspicion. "I just had an upset stomach," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He watched me like a hawk for the rest of the day, and I was sick with worry, not knowing if my short, desperate plea had even made sense. The next afternoon the doorbell rang. Standing on our porch was Linda, holding the big casserole dish I'd lent her last Christmas. "Mary," she said brightly, "I am so sorry this took me forever to return." Mark and Sarah were annoyed, but they couldn't be rude without making a scene, so they let her in. Linda walked right over and gave me a long, warm hug. As she held me, she pressed something small and plastic into the palm of my hand and whispered into my ear. "A new phone, fully charged. The lawyer's number is the only one in it. His name is Davies. He's expecting you." She pulled away, smiled at my children, and left. I stood there, clutching the burner phone in my pocket. It felt like a small, secret weapon. That night I waited until the house was completely silent, until I could hear the soft snores of my son from down the hall. I crept into my bedroom closet, pulled the door shut, and sat on the floor in the pitch dark. I turned on the new phone. There was only one contact. "Lawyer." I pressed the button. A man with a calm, serious voice answered on the first ring. "This is Mr. Davies." In a frantic whisper, I poured out the entire horrible story. John's cough, the missing keys, the stolen money, the way they were keeping us prisoner. I told him everything. I expected him to promise to send help right away, but his response was not what I wanted to hear. "Mary, I believe every word you're saying," he said, his voice steady. "But we have a serious problem. Your children will tell a judge that you are confused and paranoid. They will have documents and maybe even a doctor to back them up. Right now, it is your word against theirs." His words were like a splash of cold water. "We need proof," he continued. "Proof they cannot deny. I need you to be strong. Can you get me proof?" He hadn't promised a rescue. He had given me a battle plan. Mr. Davies's words, "Get me proof," echoed in my head. I knew where we kept all our important papers, a locked metal filing cabinet in John's little home office. My children never went in there. It was still his space. The cabinet was locked, and I couldn't find the key anywhere. Panic gave way to anger. I went to the garage, found an old screwdriver, and went back to that office. I didn't care about the noise. I jammed the screwdriver into the lock and pushed with all my strength until I heard a loud, ugly pop. The drawer slid open. Inside, beneath folders for taxes and old insurance policies, was a new one. The paper inside was crisp and clean. At the top, in big black letters, it said, "Durable Power of Attorney." I read the confusing legal words, but the meaning was simple. It gave our son, Mark, total control over our money, our house, and all of our medical decisions. It gave him the right to do exactly what he was doing. Then at the bottom of the last page I saw the signatures. There was John's name and there was mine, but it wasn't our handwriting. It was close, a clever copy, but it was a fake. A cold rock formed in my stomach. This was their master plan. It was a lie on paper. I stared at the fake signatures, my mind spinning. How could they make a lie like this look so real? Then my eyes caught a fancy seal at the bottom of the page. It had been stamped in purple ink by a notary public to make it official. I leaned in closer, squinting to read the name signed next to the stamp. My blood ran cold. I knew that name. It was a young woman from our church, a girl who had grown up with Sarah. They were close friends. The whole disgusting picture snapped into focus. My children hadn't done this alone. My daughter, Sarah, had asked her friend, her trusted, certified notary friend, to put an official stamp on their crime. That girl had smiled at me during coffee hour last month while holding this secret. This betrayal went deeper than just my own family. They had pulled someone else into their web, someone who helped them wrap their crime in a cloak of legality. My daughter had turned her own friend into an accomplice just to steal from her sick father. Who in my life was left to trust? My whole world felt like it was filled with strangers wearing friendly masks. A few days later, Mark announced that a doctor was coming to the house. "See, Mom," Sarah said, looking very proud of herself. "We told you we were taking this seriously." A tiny, foolish part of me hoped that a real doctor would see how sick John was and put a stop to all this. But that hope died the moment the man walked in. He was a slick-looking man who shook Mark's hand like they were old friends. His exam was a joke. He listened to my husband's rattling chest for less than 5 seconds and gave him a quick pat on the shoulder. "It's a nasty case of bronchitis," the doctor announced, turning away from John. "He's elderly. These things take time to clear up. A hospital would be an unnecessary stress." "But he's so weak," I pleaded, "and what he's coughing up—" The doctor waved my words away with a dismissive little smile. "It's all part of the infection," he said, looking at Mark and Sarah. "You're doing a great job." As Mark walked him to the door, I saw it. I saw my son slip a thick white envelope into the doctor's hand. It wasn't a check. It was a bribe. They hadn't just forged our names, they had bought a doctor. Their fortress of lies had just gotten taller and stronger. With the forged document and the paid-for doctor, my children felt untouchable. They stopped pretending to be kind. The cruelty, which had been hiding behind fake smiles, was now out in the open. Sarah started making John smaller meals, thin soup and dry toast. "The doctor said he needs a light diet," she'd say, her eyes daring me to challenge her. Mark would watch me struggle to help John to the bathroom and mock me. "Don't strain yourself, Mom," he'd say with a smirk. "We're the ones with the power of attorney, remember?" They were breaking my spirit, piece by piece. One afternoon, as I was putting away old blankets, I found a box of baby things from when my first grandchild was born. Tucked inside was an old nanny cam, shaped like a small black cube. A desperate idea sparked in my mind. That night, when the house was dark and quiet, I crept into the living room. I plugged the camera in behind the bookshelf and hid it inside a fake ivy plant. Its little lens poked through the leaves, pointing directly at the armchair where John spent his days. I turned it on. A tiny red light blinked once, then went dark. It was my silent witness. Now I just had to wait. For 2 days I lived with my heart in my throat, waiting for the camera to catch them. And it did. I'd check the footage at night, my hands shaking as I watched the tiny screen on the camera itself. I saw Sarah lean over John's chair while he slept and hiss, "You were costing us a fortune." I saw Mark talking on the phone, laughing as he said, "Don't worry, the old man is too weak to fight back. It'll all be over soon." But the worst part, the part that I knew would save us, was a fight they had between themselves. They were standing in the living room, thinking I was asleep. Sarah was nervous. "What if we get caught, Mark?" He was arrogant. "We have the paperwork. We have the doctor. No one can touch us." Then Sarah said the words that sealed their fate. "I just want this to be over. If he ends up in a hospital, our entire inheritance is gone." I felt sick watching it, but I also felt a jolt of power. I finally had it. Undeniable proof in their own greedy voices. I had the truth on a tiny memory card. Holding that little memory card felt like holding a bomb. The proof was useless if it stayed locked in this house with me. That night I listened from the shadows of the hallway as my children planned their next day. Sarah had an important meeting at her office at 9 a.m, and Mark had to go to the bank. There would be a window, maybe 2 hours when the house would be empty. It was my only chance. I stayed up all night, planning. I packed a small purse, not with my wallet, but with the essentials: the memory card, the burner phone from the lawyer, and John's heart medication. My plan was simple and terrifying. The moment they were gone, I would help John get dressed, and we would walk out the front door. I would call a taxi to take us straight to Mr. Davies' office. The thought of moving John, so weak and frail, made me sick with worry. What if he couldn't make it? What if one of them came back early? But sitting there in the dark, I knew one thing for sure. Staying here wasn't a risk. It was a guarantee. It was his death sentence. The house was finally silent. Mark's car left first, then Sarah's. My heart hammered as I gently shook John awake. "It's time to go, my love." Getting him out of bed and into his coat took all my strength. He was so terribly weak, leaning his full weight on me as we shuffled step by agonizing step toward the front door. We were almost there. I could see the sunlight through the little window. My hand was just reaching for the doorknob when I heard it, the sound of a car screeching to a halt in our driveway. The front door flew open before I could lock it. It was Sarah. She must have forgotten something. Her eyes darted from my face to her frail father, to the small purse clutched in my hand. "Going somewhere, Mum?" she asked, her voice dangerously quiet. Before I could answer, she snatched the purse from my shoulder and dumped its contents onto the floor. The pills, the burner phone, and the tiny memory card skittered across the wood. She picked up the card, her eyes widening with fury as she realized what it was. Her mask of kindness didn't just crack. It shattered. She grabbed my arm, her fingernails digging into my skin, and shoved me backward with a force that stunned me. John and I stumbled back as she slammed the door shut and shot the deadbolt home. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the silent house. The moment the door was locked, Sarah was on her phone to Mark. He was home in 15 minutes, his face dark with rage. The performance was over. There were no more gentle words, no more fake smiles. They herded John and me into our bedroom, and I heard the key turn in the lock from the outside. We were prisoners. A few moments later, Mark's voice came through the door, cold and final. "You forced our hand, Mum," he said. "We were trying to handle this quietly, but you just couldn't leave it alone." I could hear the smirk in his voice. "I've already made a call. We have a competency hearing for you tomorrow. I'm going to give the judge that little memory card. I'll show him your paranoid recordings. I'll tell him how you tried to drag a sick old man out into the street. They'll see you as a danger to yourself and to him." He paused, letting the words sink in. "They're going to put you away somewhere safe, Mum, and we'll finally be able to give Dad the peace and quiet he needs." The horror washed over me. He had twisted my only weapon and turned it against me. The trap had been sprung. I spent the next day in a fog of despair, locked in that room. John was fading, and I had failed him. They had won. They brought us bland meals on cheap paper plates, leaving them outside the door like we were animals. That evening, as I picked up the plate of cold chicken, my thumb brushed against the bottom. I felt something rough. Pencil. My hands trembled as I flipped it over. Scrawled in faint, shaky letters was a message. "They hired me to drop off groceries. Say you're both very sick. I don't believe them. I see their eyes. Something is wrong. Leave a sign in the window if you need help. Carol." It was from my neighbour, the woman I thought had been fooled. Tears streamed down my face as I read the words again and again. She knew. She had seen the evil in their eyes too. It was the tiniest pinprick of light in a vast and suffocating darkness. I had an ally. I had one last impossible chance, but what kind of sign could I possibly give that my children wouldn't see? What could I do that wouldn't get her into terrible trouble and ruin everything? I stared at Carol's note, my mind racing. A sign in the window. It couldn't be a note. My children would find it. It couldn't be me waving. They would see me. It had to be something that looked like nothing. My eyes fell on John's dresser drawer, where he kept his old handkerchiefs. He loved colourful ones, a habit from a time when men were a bit fancier. I pulled one out, a bright, cheerful yellow one. Then it hit me. The beginning of this whole nightmare was a dark stain on a white handkerchief. Carol had stopped by just days after that, and she'd seen how terrified I was. This was it. This was the signal. I walked over to the window that faced her house and carefully tucked a corner of the yellow cloth into the window frame, letting the rest of it hang down outside. To Mark or Sarah, it would look like a forgotten piece of laundry, a bit of colour in a dreary window. But I prayed that to Carol, it would be a symbol. It would be a bright, desperate flag, a silent scream that connected back to that first day of sickness and fear. I stepped back from the window. My whole life, and John's, now depended on a good neighbour and a square of yellow cotton. The next day was the longest of my life. I watched the little yellow cloth flutter in the breeze, my hope rising and falling with it. By the afternoon, I started to despair. Maybe she didn't see it. Maybe it was a silly, foolish idea. Then I heard it. A loud, official knock on the front door that shook the whole house. I heard my son Mark open it. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice full of annoyance. A firm woman's voice answered, loud enough for me to hear. "We're from Adult Protective Services. We've received a report of concern. We need to perform a wellness check on Mary and John." I heard Sarah gasp. Mark started to argue, but a man's voice, even firmer, cut him off. "Sir, we have an officer with us. You can either let us in or we can get a warrant. It's your choice." There was a heavy silence, and then I heard the key turning in my bedroom lock. Mark opened the door, a fake, worried smile plastered on his face. Behind him stood two serious-looking women and a police officer. Carol had done it. Help was here. The moment the caseworkers stepped into the room, I opened my mouth to speak, but Mark was faster. "We are so glad you're here," he said, his voice dripping with false relief. "We've been so worried about Mum." It was the beginning of the performance of a lifetime. He and Sarah had an answer for everything. They calmly presented the forged power of attorney, showing they were legally in charge. They showed the report from the doctor they had bribed, proving a professional said John should stay home. Then Sarah began to cry, her shoulders shaking with fake sobs. "Mum hasn't been herself," she choked out. "She gets so confused. She even tried to attack me and drag Dad out of the house the other day. She has these paranoid fantasies. She even made secret recordings." I watched in horror as the caseworkers' faces softened. They looked from my weeping daughter to me, and their eyes were filled with pity, not for a victim, but for a crazy old woman. They were believing it. They were believing every single lie. They were about to leave me here. The caseworker gave me a sad, gentle smile. "It's okay, Mary. We'll let you get your rest." They were turning to leave. This was it. My last second. A wave of pure desperation washed over me. My eyes darted to my old sewing basket on the table beside me. With a trembling hand, I reached for it and, with a sudden jerk, knocked the whole thing over. Spools of thread and hundreds of buttons scattered across the wooden floor with a loud clatter. It worked. Everyone, even Mark and Sarah, instinctively bent down to help the frail old lady pick up her things. "Oh my," I whimpered, sinking to my knees with them. In that moment of distraction, with all eyes on the floor, my fingers found the small pair of sewing scissors. While their hands were busy with buttons, mine was at the hem of my housecoat. I'd had a moment of foresight before they locked me in. I knew Sarah had taken the first memory card, but the camera had come with a spare. I had stitched the second one into the hem. With one quick hidden snip, the tiny plastic square fell into my palm. I closed my fist around it. It was my last bet in a game I was about to lose forever. I pushed myself up, my body shaking. The lead caseworker helped me to my feet. "There now, Mary," she said kindly. It was now or never. I lunged forward and grabbed her by the arm, my grip surprisingly strong. I uncurled my fist and pressed the tiny memory card into her hand. "Please," I begged, my voice raw. "You have a computer. Just listen to it. That's all I ask. If you still think I'm crazy after you hear it, then take me away. But please, just listen." Mark stepped forward. "See what I mean? She's completely lost her mind." But the caseworker looked from my desperate face to the tiny card in her hand, and a flicker of doubt crossed her features. She looked at the police officer, who gave a slight nod. "All right, Mary," she said. "Let's go to the living room." She sat on the sofa, opened her laptop, and slid the card in. The room was so quiet I could hear my own heart pounding. Then my children's voices filled the air, cold, clear, and damning. They heard Mark laughing about his father being weak. They heard Sarah complaining about the inheritance. The caseworkers' faces turned from pity to stone. The police officer stared at my children. The performance was over. The truth was screaming from the laptop speakers. When the recording ended, a thick, heavy silence hung in the room. The caseworker slowly closed her laptop and looked at my son and daughter. Her eyes were like chips of ice. The police officer was the first to move. He calmly stepped between them and me, creating a human wall. "You two," he said in a low, even voice, "stay right where you are." One of the women was already on her phone, her voice sharp and urgent. "I need an ambulance dispatched immediately. Elderly male, signs of severe neglect." Everything became a blur. The officer was asking Mark and Sarah questions, and for the first time they had no answers. Their faces, once so confident and cruel, had crumpled into masks of pure panic. I just sat on the armchair, a silent observer as my life was torn apart and then put back together in a new, terrifying shape. Soon the sound of sirens grew louder and louder until they stopped right outside our door. Paramedics rushed in with equipment and finally, began to care for John. They put an oxygen mask on his pale face and gently lifted him onto a stretcher. He was safe. I watched them carry my husband out to a new life. Then I watched the officer lead my children out to theirs. I had won. But as I sat alone in the sudden quiet of my home, I had to ask myself, what had I truly lost? The hospital was a world of quiet beeps and clean white sheets. For the first time in months I could breathe. The doctors were kind, but their words were hard to hear. "It's severe pneumonia, Mary," one of them told me, his face grim, "and a very bad lung infection. To be honest, if you had waited a few more days, he would not have survived." His words were a cold validation of the fight I had fought. I hadn't been overreacting. I hadn't been paranoid. I had been right. I spent weeks in a chair beside John's bed, holding his hand and watching the steady rise and fall of his chest. The lawyer, Mr. Davies, would call with updates about the case. He'd say things like elder abuse and forgery, but the words felt like they were about strangers. My only focus was the man in the bed. Then, one Tuesday morning, exactly 3 weeks after I knocked over that sewing basket, I felt a squeeze. John's eyes were open and they were clear. He looked right at me and whispered my name. In that moment, I knew we had truly survived. The real healing could finally begin. A month later, I sat in Mr. Davies's office. John was beside me in a wheelchair, still weak but looking 100 times better. Mr. Davies had been digging into our children's lives, and he had found the truth. "It wasn't just about the inheritance, Mary," he said gently. "It was about desperation. Mark had over $100,000 in gambling debts. Sarah lost a fortune in a bad investment. They needed cash, and they needed it immediately. So it wasn't just greed. It was a panicked, ugly desperation that had turned them into monsters." Then Mr. Davies slid a document across the table. It was our will. "There's one last thing," he said. "Something they never knew. Do you remember 5 years ago when you amended your will?" My mind was a fog, but John nodded slowly. The lawyer explained that we had set up a charitable trust. Upon our deaths, the house, the savings, almost everything we owned, was to be automatically donated to the cancer research wing of the very hospital that had just saved John's life. All the cruelty, all the lies, all the horror they put us through, it was to get their hands on an inheritance that never even existed for them. They had destroyed our family for nothing. Months have passed. It's autumn now, and the morning air is crisp and clean. John is back in his garden, a little slower than before, but his hands are steady as he snips the dead heads off my roses. Our house is quiet now. The angry, greedy ghosts have been banished. Mark and Sarah were found guilty, and they are in prison. We took their names out of the will, not that there was much left for them to inherit anyway. It's a sad, quiet ending for them. But for us, it's a new beginning. I found a strength in myself I never knew was there. I'm not the scared, helpless woman I was. I'm the woman who saved her husband. As I sat on the porch watching John, I opened a letter from my sister Janet. I read one line, and a familiar chill went down my spine. "A woman from my church," she wrote, "is having trouble with her son. He's taken her checkbook, and she's too scared to tell anyone." I folded the letter and looked at my husband, who smiled at me from across the yard. Our nightmare was over. But I now knew that in quiet houses, in quiet towns all across the country, other nightmares were just beginning.